Hi, everybody. Dr. Charlton here again. Today, I'm going to go through a real live example of how different groups are doing survey research. So, we've already talked quite a bit about survey research, and now here we're going to see it applied in the real world, and we're going to look at it in a political context. So, I'm going to look. So, as I make this video, the political world is heating up with an upcoming general election that looks like it's going to be between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So we have polls here. So it turns out polls follow a lot of the same survey standards and protocols that we do in marketing research. So we can use a lot of this information to kind of guide and learn about how we want to do things. So there's a series of polls here. These polls are showing general election results, expected general election results between Trump and Biden. Now, this is really early in this race, and there are two crises occurring as I speak. One it relates to the coronavirus, and the other one relates to the stock market tanking and the economic turmoil related to the coronavirus. So, this all could change, but for now, here's the polling. So, first of all, we have this Emerson poll where Biden is currently ahead by 6. But again, like I said, that doesn't really mean anything because it's all, Trump's election fortunes are all going to come down to how do people perceive how he deals with this one crisis, right? Well, it's really one crisis because it's all caused by coronavirus. So if people perceive that he handles it well, he'll get reelected. If not, he won't. But for now, all we have are these polls. So let's take a look at them. First of all, this top one, the most recent poll, is from Emerson. So let's take a look at their methodology and see what they're up to. So I can click on this link right here in Real Politics. And then I'm going to go ahead and look and see how they did their polling. So I actually have to scroll down pretty far to get to their methodology. So they explain a lot of their findings, which is great. But let's start with their methodology because that's really what we're interested in because we're learning how to do marketing research and then we'll go backwards from there. So, first of all, here at the very end, there's a paragraph here. I have no idea why this header is caller ID, but this is their methodology, okay? So, they conducted their survey on 2 days in March. They give the days. Our sample consisted of registered Democratic, Republican, and Independent voters. So, they did not poll non registered voters. They didn't ask non registered voters about their opinions because they're assuming they're not going to vote, so it won't matter. So, they just focus on registered voters. N equals 1,100. That means their sample size was 1,100. They talked to 1,100 people, right? So you can see that right there. N equals 1,100. So they have this measure called credibility interval, which is similar to a margin of error. So margin of error is basically it's basically telling you how accurate they think the results are. So if they say in this poll, I think they say that Joe Biden is up by 7 points or 9 points. I can't remember the percentage, but here they have a caveat that that's plus or minus 2.9%. So the true value could be the 5% or it could be 12%. That is the actual amount that Joe Biden is in the lead currently. Now, keep in mind, this is really early. This is a March poll, right? And the election happens in November, long after a lot of this coronavirus stuff is going to go down. So it could change, but for right now, Joe Biden is ahead. And, I think we'll say 7% plus or minus 2.9%. So they do give the margin of error. That's based on some statistical measures around the variance in the data or how widely the responses varied. Okay, so the data sets were weighted by gender, age, ethnicity, education, and region. So when they say they weighted it, what that means is so you're in a situation, right, where you have you have males, Hispanics, African Americans, people in the South, people in the Northeast. All these people are going to have different opinions. So a lot of times your data set is not going to be perfectly representative. A lot of times you're going to get the South overrepresented. You're going to have like, we sampled 1,100 people and half of them were from the South. But you can't just use the data as is, right? Because the South doesn't determine the election by itself. It requires all parts of the country. So what they do is the few people that they did get from the Northeast, they sort of increase the weight of their response. They basically like multiply it. So times two. So if there's only half as many people from the Northeast as there should be relative to people from the South, then you can multiply those responses from the Northeast by two and just kind of increase the weighting of it. And that way you get a kind of a more representative sample. They do emphasize here that that increases the margin of error as the sample size is reduced. Now, the sample size is not reduced, it's still 1,100, but the per cell sample size is reduced, right? Because, you might, so for example, males that are 30 to 39, that are Democrat, that are Hispanic, that are in the Northeast, you might only have one, right? And so then you're weighting that cell by quite a bit. You're giving that equal weight to another cell, where the females that fit the same description might have you might have 20 of them in your sample, but you're equally weighting that one person with the 20 because you're trying to weight it based on based on all these essentially demographic criteria. Um, so they collected the data using landlines. So interactive voice response system, it's some kind of robocall type thing where once it answers, I'm assuming then they can talk to the person. N equals 645. So they had 645 responses from that. And then they supplemented it with an online panel that they got from MTurk of 455 people. So MTurk is Amazon Mechanical Turk. So Amazon maintains a panel of like survey respondents, participants that anybody can pay them, 60 cents or $1.50 to complete a survey. And then you have, that's, essentially data that you can use for your study. In this case, they used it for polling. So this is really simple. I mean, they don't give a ton of detail. One thing we don't know is like what their actual questions were, and there might be some place where we can find more detail about their measurement tool. But as I scroll up, there could be reasons why we want to know what the questions were. Because so let's see what was the, and they may describe the questions here in the text in the results as well. Let's see. Um, this has the actual question. With coronavirus, how concerned are you about your personal health / finances? And some people are worried. A lot of people are not too worried. Some people are very concerned. And so this is split by purple versus black. So personal finances, people are more worried about their money than they are about their health. And we have this huge, scary virus attacking our country. I'm assuming that's because a lot of people have recognized that they're not in a vulnerable category. Okay. So, but they still should be worried because it can get anybody, but they're more worried about their money. And that makes sense because we need to keep the lights on our house, we need to pay the bills and put food on the table and all that kind of stuff, right? So, so this has the actual question. Now, you'd like to have the actual question um, because sometimes how the question is worded makes all the difference. Like if a question was like, um, how much do you dislike Trump on a scale of 1 to 7? And then people are forced to answer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. And even the people in the one category, they might really actually like Trump, but they're forced into this saying how much they dislike him. So then, the result is 100% of people dislike Trump. You know what I mean? So the wording of the survey item can often be a huge, huge deal, but often it's concealed. Like you don't see the actual wording, so you don't really know what's being asked or answered. They talk about among Democrats, 68% disapprove, and among Republicans, 84% approve of the way he is handling the response. But again, like, what's the question? Like, do you, um, I don't actually see the question here, the exact question. So we can assume it's something close to, do you approve of the job Donald Trump is doing as president? Or, sorry, I, um, I'm actually talking about the coronavirus. So, um, do you approve of the job that Trump is doing in handling the federal government's response to the outbreak of the coronavirus? So that's kind of a long, sort of really wordy question, which is tricky, right? Because if you're trying to answer this, there's a lot going on there. Is Trump doing a good job in handling the federal government's response to the outbreak of coronavirus? You could probably shorten that. You could probably take some words out, right? Like, and maybe be more respectful too, because if you diminish somebody, if you diminish, it's tricky, right? Because if you are super respectful and you agree with the job, approve of the job the president is doing, it almost sounds like it's implied that you should agree, you should approve. But if you say, um, do you approve of the job that Trump is doing? Then it's almost like you should disapprove. So you don't want to kind of lead them with the language. But I would opt for more formal and genteel and say, do you approve of the job that President Trump is doing? And I would skip the federal government response part and just say, do you approve of the job that President Trump is doing in handling and reacting to the coronavirus outbreak? So that could definitely be simplified, right? Because think about it. What other aspect of the coronavirus outbreak is Trump handling besides the federal government's response? I mean, he has his own business interests, right? But we don't care about that. So it's obvious we're worried about the federal government's response. So you can just ask how good of a job is Trump doing? You don't have to ask how good of a job is he doing in handling the federal government's response. Just take the federal government's response out of there. Make it simpler for people, make it less confusing and more straightforward. Also, again, back to language. This could get really tricky if you ask kind of a leading question. Say again, the question is like, how, well do you approve of the job that he's doing? How well do you disapprove how much do you disapprove of the job? You can see those are two totally different questions, and you may get a slightly different answer set, right? Depending on how you ask the question. And so a lot of people who have some kind of bias, they use these types of surveys to kind of get the response that they want to get, right? And so you have to try to use neutral language as much as you can when you're doing this kind of survey. I'm going to look at another one that's more detailed, that has um, a lot of the questions, the instrument, all the details about how they did it. And that's going to be the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Again, this is super, super detailed. We're not going to have time to go through all this, but I love this because they've included the whole instrument, right? So they've interviewed 900 registered voters, including 495 respondents with a cell phone only, and 13 respondents reached on a cell phone, but who also have a landline. Very detailed, right? The information they give here. 74 additional interviews were completed with Democratic primary voters in order to achieve a total of N equals 438 interviews. So what that tells you is, in the original sample was too heavy Republican, so they had to follow up with more find more Democratic voters in order to get their sample more even. The tricky thing too is, let's think about this, right? So one of the things pollsters have to figure out is who is really actually going to vote, okay? Because when it comes down to it, what if for some reason the Democrats just show up more, right? They're more excited about their candidate, they're whatever, the grassroots, efforts just work more. And so then a lot of the polling that you do that's representative across all of the the voters doesn't really matter, right? Because you didn't get a random sample of voters showing up to the polls. You got a more heavily, you got a lot more Democrats showing up in that case than you did Republicans. So it wasn't like a random sample of all registered voters. It was like you got a lot more Democrats just to go to the polls. So you have to think about that, right? And that is something that actually pollsters do try to predict. They try to figure out how many Republicans versus Democrats are actually going to show up to the polls. And I can tell you that's what gets really sticky, right? Because it's not just a neutral, like we're taking a random sample, which means just randomly picking, like if I had a big jar of jelly beans and it was all mixed up with all the voters in the world, every flavor, and I'm just randomly picking that. Um, and that's how I get my sample. That's actually not how people are deciding to go to the polls, right? Because people are going to the polls based on, these Democrats are just more excited about it. So when it comes to who's going to the polls, actually it's not randomly drawn out of my jelly bean jar, right? The Democrat ones are coming out in higher numbers. Okay, so that's something to think about. That's something that pollsters have to deal with, and it makes it really tricky to predict who is going to get elected president. The other thing is they have a margin of error here. So they say three plus or minus 3.27%. So I believe in this one they have, I can't remember the number again. I think they had Joe Biden up by, we'll say 7% again. So it's plus or minus 3.27%. So if he's up 7%, that shouldn't matter. Um, but because he should win either way, right? But if the margin of error is 3.27% and he's up by 2%, then our prediction could be totally wrong, right? And the prediction could be wrong anyway. One thing that happened with President Trump and Hillary Clinton when they were in the election back in 2016 in November was that all the polls had her winning by a small margin. And one of the issues is that the errors went in the same direction. Okay. So they had polls from Ohio, New York, Florida, and all the swing states. The polling was showing that Hillary Clinton was going to win all those swing states, the states that really mattered. Ohio's an important state, Florida's an important state. But when it came down to it, he won all those states. He won Pennsylvania. He won all those swing states, one after another, after another, after another. And the issue is, this is something that we call the errors are correlated in statistics. Another way to say it would be the polls were all wrong, all slightly wrong for the same reason. We don't know what that reason was, right? So maybe there were a lot of people who were undecided. A lot of the undecideds went to Trump, or a lot of people, or the Republicans just showed up in larger numbers than the Democrats were. The Democrats just felt like Hillary Clinton was going to win, so why would they bother going down there? They weren't as fired up about it. It could be something like that. It's hard to know. But ultimately, he did win all those swing states, and the overall prediction was wrong. But because all the polls in all the swing states gave it to Hillary Clinton, people thought that gave it a total certainty, right? It's like, one of those polls could be wrong, but they couldn't all be wrong. And actually, they all were slightly wrong in the same direction because they all had kind of the same error in it. It's hard to know what it was at this point. It was maybe like I could think of a variety of reasons why all these polls were slightly off. Like, maybe people were embarrassed to say that they were going to vote for President Trump because they were worried about what their friends would think. Maybe the Republicans who weren't planning to go to the polls actually got fired up and they decided to go down there. Maybe the Democrats, got lazy and they just didn't want to show up that day. Maybe a lot of Republicans who were fed up, didn't really agree with Donald Trump and they were going to flip to Democrat. Maybe they changed their mind last minute. I mean, who knows what happened, but ultimately, right, the every single poll was just slightly off. Now it was within the margin of error. So the margin of error for most of these polls gave Donald Trump a chance. And, they were all wrong in the same direction. So anyway, I'm going to keep going through this and see what else we can find. You can see they gave this beautiful breakdown of who they have in all these different categories. And you can see this is really clean. Nice, even numbers. These categories that have more voters, like these higher ages, they have quite a few in there, which is nice because between 55 and 70, there's a lot of voting happening, honestly. So that's good. These lower ages have less voting, but they have fewer here in the sample. So that seems to work out pretty good. Let's look at the questions. Question 2A. Okay, so question 2A is old. Would you please tell me how old you are? And so they give a category. Question 2B, these are all demographic questions. You're Spanish speaking. So this is, again, they're collecting all this data, even though this isn't what we really want to know. We're not asking, our main question is who's going to win this election. But it is an important question, like who's doing the best with the Spanish speaking voters, because that's like an important key demographic, right? So so one thing that Donald Trump did better than Mitt Romney, so Mitt Romney was the Republican candidate in prior years. So Donald Trump got more minority votes. I mean, he just did. He got more Hispanics and more Asians and more, just generally more minorities. So if you see a Republican candidate that's doing well with minority voters, then he or she has a pretty good shot at the election, because normally that's not a category you do well with. So that can be kind of like an indicator. So you want to collect that data, even though it's not the most central thing. Like you really want to know who's going to win. But this could be kind of like a diagnostic kind of indicator, kind of to tell you why they might win or why they might not. So here we're collecting race, again, so that you can break it down by, who's winning among different demographics and stuff like that. Registered voter, yes or no. It looks like anybody who is not a registered voter, they probably just threw out of their data set or didn't talk to them, hung up the phone on them. I don't know, but everybody is supposedly a registered voter in their data set. That doesn't mean they're going to vote, right? A lot of people are registered automatically when they get their driver's license. They may not vote. A lot of people would just think all politicians are crooks, so it doesn't make a difference whether they vote Democrat or Republican, so they're not going to bother. Now, all in all, do you think things in the nation are generally headed in the right direction, or do you feel things are off on the wrong track? And so this is a question kind of about checking the overall political climate. When people feel like things are on the wrong track, they want change, right? They want a new political party, new leader. So that's why this question's asked. Let's take a look at the wording of the question. All in all, this could be shortened, right? I mean, it'd be nice to shorten it a little bit without losing its meaning, but it's a decent question. It's just got a lot of commas and clauses, and like just the average person who doesn't have like a advanced degree is gonna struggle with all these different clauses. Now, comma, all in all, comma, do you think things in the nation are generally headed in the right direction, comma, or do you feel things are off on the wrong track? So you could just say, are things in the nation generally headed in the right direction, or are they on the wrong track? Just make it simple, make it easy for the people. And then they have this data. So this gives some clue about the scale. They had 37 people say it's headed in the right direction. 56 say it's off on the wrong track, and 4 are mixed, and 3 are not sure. So what I would do is do a 7-point scale. So I would ask them, where do they fall on the scale? Do they think are they neutral? Are they in the middle of the scale, which would be 4? Or do they think it's way in the wrong track, in the wrong direction? That's 7. Do they think it's totally going the right way, the way that we wanted to go. That's one. And then figure out where they fall on that scale. It's much more useful data. Sometimes when you force people into yes or no categories, you're just not getting as much data, which is can be sometimes a little bit disappointing. But here it looks like they have just split it into those two categories. And then I can't understand these top numbers here. I apologize, but sometimes, I mean, they really should explain this. So ideally, like in this instrument, as they're explaining how they did this, they really should spell this out a little better. I mean, I understand this, but what these different columns are, 20 slash '08 plus 1 slash 19, 12 slash 18. It's tricky. So we get down to nine. Okay, so these are years. March 20th, December 2019, um, August 2019, so January of 2019. These are years. And they go back to April of 2009. They could just say that and make it easy for the people, but instead they did it this way, try to make me pick out the pattern. So I could check the change over time. This is not the right way to visualize the change over time like that. It's really hard for me to go through and try to figure out what's the change over time, but at least the data is here. So if I could put this data in the table, make a chart, and then I could get that change over time. So it's really cool that they're collecting it over a long time. Um, in general, okay, here we go. This is probably the last question I want to look at. In general, do you approve or disapprove of the job Donald Trump is doing as president? If approve slash disapprove, and do you strongly or just somewhat approve, disapprove of the job Donald Trump is doing as president? So this could be just made into one question, right? From 1 to 7. You don't really need to split it into two questions like this. It's like 4 is neither approve nor disapprove, 7 is strongly approve, and 1 is strongly disapprove. And it just makes it easy for people. To just have one scale and one question. And then that way they don't have to force themselves into thinking which category are they in. They could just say, and then this doesn't give them the option to choose the midpoint. Some people might just want to be neutral and they don't really approve or disapprove. Maybe they don't know. It doesn't really give them the option to choose the midpoint, unfortunately, but a lot of people like to choose the midpoint. So you're kind of losing some data there by forcing them to take a stand on approval or disapproval because it inserts random data, random noise into it, right? Because people are like, I don't know, like, fine, I'll disapprove, I'll approve, whatever, just put me down for something, and so you don't want that. You want to, if somebody's neutral, you want to collect that data so you're not going to force them to answer a question like this, if that makes sense. Um, Okay, I'm going to ask this next. I'm going to go through maybe a couple more. There's a lot happening in America during this period of time. How about you? What are you thinking or focusing on most about what is happening in this country? Probe. Please tell me more about the reasons this is what you're thinking or focusing on right now. See recorded responses. Okay, so this is like a really open ended response, and it's going to be tricky to analyze in this data, but at least they have some ideas that they can do follow-up studies and find out more if more people feel that way. Um, so this is a nice scale, right? So they're ranking, now I'm going to read you the name of several public figures and organizations, and I'd like you to rate your feelings toward each one as very positive, somewhat positive, neutral, somewhat negative, or very negative. If you don't know the name, please just say so. Always ask Donald Trump first, it says, and then rotate 2 through 5. So they asked Donald Trump, and then they have Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, CDC, and Mike Pence. Okay, so they go through all those names and ask them the same thing. You can see they've collected for CDC, they've only been collecting that for a few terms. No, actually, this goes back to 2014. So they just started checking 20 CDC again. They did do it in 2014. There must have been another epidemic scare. I think it was around Ebola, maybe that was the Ebola scare. But now, of course, we have the coronavirus, so they're asking about that again. So let's see. Let's look at Donald Trump. So for uh, March 2020, he's very positive numbers are up to 29. But if you look back to July of 1990, he was at 3. Okay, so there's a lot more people. You can see his positivity level has gone up over time. Um, and he's ever since, let's see, where did he get elected? So he got elected in November of 2016. So this 20 was the first post-election measure. So he was at 20 and then, kind of climbed up, and he's doing pretty good now. Um, let's look at his very negative numbers though. So for very negative, it looks like he peaked out in April of 2016 with a 53, but then those negative numbers dropped a little bit and he got elected. And you can see the very negative numbers are lower here in December of 2016, right after his election. And, they're in the 40s, the low 40s. Anyway, this is a really nice scale because it has a midpoint, so people could be neutral. They don't have to decide if they feel positive or negative about him. Maybe they have mixed feelings. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they haven't thought about it. Maybe they don't care. And so they can be neutral. Now, you don't really need this category, like don't know, name, not sure. That could just be included with this neutral data, right? So neutral could be don't know, don't care, haven't decided. It doesn't matter why they're neutral. You don't care why they're neutral. So don't have this column. Just have a 5-point scale from very positive to very negative, and just usually I reverse that. So usually I'll do very negative to very positive because when I run statistical models, it's just easier when the positive stuff is a higher number than the negative stuff. Otherwise, I have to do tricky things like reverse the whole variable, like flip it, like numerically. So, and it can get really confusing when you're doing statistics and you have a number that you want to be lower to be good. Normally, like the higher number, the better when you do run statistics. So I would flip this scale and I would remove this column and just, if somebody doesn't know name, not sure, then they're neutral, if that makes sense. Cool. So that was a good scale item. I'm glad we got to look at that and review that in terms of, for us to be able to write survey questions of our own. And since it was such a good one, it makes me want to do like at least one more. We'll see what else we have. Now, thinking specifically about the 2020 Democratic primary elections, I'm going to read a list of 3 of the declared candidates running for the Democratic nomination for president. After I read the entire list, please tell me if a Democratic primary for president, if a Democratic primary for, they have a typo there, I think, for president were being held today. Oh, no, that's right. If a Democratic primary for president were being held today, which one of the following candidates would you favor? Well, which way do you, if they're not sure, ask, well, which way do you lean? Okay, so they only need one answer from each person, right? Because they want to know what the percentage is of each of these candidates. There is information left out there, however, because a lot of these candidates are going to be gone. In fact, they're already gone. Tulsi Gabbard dropped out, so all that's left is Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So, where are those Tulsi Gabbard voters going to go? Are they going to go for Bernie Sanders? Are they going to go for Joe Biden? We don't know. And so this doesn't have all the data that you want. You really want to know who's the second choice for the Tulsi Gabbard people. It looks like it won't make much difference, though, because Joe Biden has a commanding lead here, 61% to 32%. But if it was closer, and if Tulsi Gabbard did have a bigger following, you'd want to know. So they're probably going to ask other questions to try to get at that, right? Anyway, so we've kind of gone through a real life survey. A poll is a survey. You can you can read their questions, you can look at their sampling methods, decide if you want to believe them. But more importantly, for us, this is just an example of a survey that's published. A lot of marketing surveys never get published because they're internal data held by companies. And so I can't get that and show that to you. But a lot of political data is public. And so I try to be politically neutral because my specialty is marketing, not politics. So I'm not trying to wade into any political waters. But they do have really good data. So I like to look at that data and see how, how we can use that and interpret it to improve our own survey instruments. So I hope you all learned a little bit from this. And if anything seemed unclear, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks a lot.